I noticed the circle by accident. It wasn't marked in red or crossed out the way restricted areas usually are. It was just empty. A perfect, pale ring on an otherwise detailed ranger map, floating above the northern slope of Klingman's dome. No contour lines, no elevation data, no notes, just a soft void where information should have been. I remember thinking it looked like a smudge, the kind you get when a printer runs out of ink. But the paper was clean. Too clean. I asked another ranger about it. He glanced once, then folded the map and handed it back like it burned. "Old misprint," he said. Too fast. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I checked archived maps, every version, going back decades. The circle was always there, same size, same place, never explained. What unsettled me wasn't the absence of data, but the care taken to preserve it. Trails bent subtly around the area. Maintenance logs skipped mile markers. Incident reports stopped mid-sentence when they drifted too close. It felt deliberate, like the land itself had requested privacy and been granted it. I drew the circle again in my personal notebook. As soon as the pencil touched paper, I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a quiet resistance, as if something unseen was asking me not to remember why it was there. The warnings didn't come from official channels. They surfaced in places no one bothered to catalog anymore. Handwritten margins, brittle notebooks, oral stories shared only after long pauses. I found the first one in a box labeled Cultural Outreach, buried in a storage room that smelled like dust and mildew. Inside were copied Cherokee accounts, translated poorly, describing a high place where the world grows thin. They warned of voices that imitate the living and paths that move when you aren't looking at them. Later, I spoke with an elderly local who'd lived near the park his entire life. When I mentioned the upper slopes near Klingman's dome, his expression changed. He told me his grandfather called it a listening ground. Animals avoided it. Hunters lost time there. Those who returned never spoke about what they saw, only about what followed them home. Even early settler journals echoed the same fear. Men wrote about compasses spinning, prayers spoken backward without realizing it, and a feeling that something just out of sight was learning their names. None of them tried to explain it. They simply wrote one sentence again and again, as if repetition made it safer. Do not linger. Do not map it. That was when I understood the circle wasn't hiding something dangerous. It was hiding something patient. I didn't hear the rule during training. It wasn't printed in any manual or whispered during orientation. I learned it the way most people learn dangerous truths, by asking the wrong question in the wrong room. We were sitting around the ranger station late one night, radios quiet, rain pressing against the windows. I mentioned the blank circle. Just that. Nothing else. The conversation died instantly. One ranger stood up and left. Another stared at the floor like he'd dropped something important and didn't want to bend down for it. Finally, Bill spoke. His voice was calm, almost bored. "If someone crosses that line," he said, "they're already gone." No explanation followed. None was offered. I pushed, lightly at first. Lost how? Dead? Missing? Bill shook his head. Neither. Those are conclusions. This isn't that. He told me search and rescue protocols changed near the zone. Radios weren't trusted. Dogs weren't used twice. And no one, under any circumstances, marked a confirmed crossing in ink. Later. Alone. I reviewed missing persons files. Patterns emerged. Experienced hikers. Calm final reports. No signs of struggle. The same phrase appeared in multiple witness statements, separated by decades. They didn't seem afraid. That night, I realized the rule wasn't meant to protect us. It was meant to protect whatever noticed when the rule was broken. Jennifer Walsh's final radio call came in at 14:17. I remember because I logged it myself. Her voice was steady, professional. The voice of someone who had spent years in backcountry terrain and trusted her own judgment. She reported mild disorientation, blamed the fog, joked that the trail felt longer than it should. No distress, no panic, just an observation. A minute later, she called again. Same calm tone. She said her GPS was drifting, numbers sliding instead of changing. She laughed once, quietly, and said she'd stop for a moment to get her bearings. That was the last complete sentence we ever heard from her. The final transmission wasn't words. It was sound, wind, maybe, or breath pulled too close to the microphone. Then something else layered beneath it, a low, almost musical hum, rising and falling like a choir warming up in the distance. I asked her to repeat. Static answered, but it felt wrong, uneven, as if something was shaping the noise. When the signal dropped, the radio didn't click off. It stayed open for several seconds, broadcasting silence that felt crowded. Later, when I replayed the recording, I noticed a faint detail I'd missed before. Right before the cutoff, Jennifer whispered, very softly, "It knows I'm here." We found Jennifer's backpack 2 days later, just inside the edge of the restricted zone. It wasn't torn, buried, or abandoned the way lost gear usually is. It was standing upright against a tree, straps folded inward, rain cover tucked neatly into its pocket. The zipper tabs were aligned. Someone had taken their time with it. Inside, everything was accounted for. Food rations unopened, first aid kit sealed, extra socks rolled tight, still dry despite the weather. Her water bladder was full, her knife clean. It looked less like a hiker's pack and more like an offering, arranged carefully for inspection. The only thing missing was urgency. No sign she'd been in trouble, no indication she'd meant to leave it behind. What bothered me most was the ground around it. No scuffed soil, no broken branches. The leaf litter lay undisturbed, as if the pack had always been there, grown out of the forest instead of carried into it. One ranger joked that maybe she'd gone back for it later. No one laughed. When I lifted the pack, I felt a brief resistance, like static clinging to my gloves. For a second, I had the irrational thought that something was deciding whether to let it go. As we walked away, I glanced back once. I could have sworn the space where the backpack had been looked emptier than it should have, like something important had just been taken. And the forest noticed. We stayed longer than we should have. Protocol said mark the location, secure the evidence, withdraw before dusk. But no one moved. The forest felt expectant, like a held breath. Sounds behaved strangely there. Footsteps carried too far, then vanished completely. A bird call repeated once, then again, perfectly identical, as if replayed rather than made. That was when I noticed the silence reacting to us. When someone spoke, the woods seemed to lean in. Not quieter, focused. Even the wind shifted direction, brushing past our ears instead of through the trees. I tested it, quietly saying Jennifer's name. The air tightened. Somewhere deeper in the trees, something answered, not with a voice, but with alignment, as if paths had subtly rearranged themselves toward us. Then came the sound. Not loud, not sudden. A thin, distant tone. Almost like singing heard through water. It rose when we stood still and faded when we moved, tracking attention rather than position. One ranger swore it was coming from behind us. Another said above, I couldn't place it at all, only feel it adjusting, tuning itself. I realized then that we weren't being hunted. We were being observed, measured. The forest wasn't hostile, it was curious. And whatever was listening wasn't interested in our bodies or our gear. It was waiting for something far more fragile. It was listening for recognition. I saw it first out of the corner of my eye, the way you notice heat rising off asphalt in summer. Only this was wrong. The temperature was cool, steady, but the air ahead of me rippled as if reality itself had grown tired of holding its shape. When I turned to face it directly, the distortion didn't stop. It deepened. The trees beyond the bend stretched upward, elongating like reflections in warped glass. Trunks leaned at impossible angles without falling. Leaves hung frozen mid-motion, trembling slightly, as if caught between decisions. I raised my hand and watched my fingers blur, their outlines lagging behind the movement by a fraction of a second. It felt like pushing through water that didn't want to be disturbed. As I stepped closer, the forest peeled back, not vanished, shifted. Through the bending air, I glimpsed shapes that didn't belong to any geometry I knew. Tall, jagged forms rose in the distance, faceted and dark, reflecting no light yet somehow visible. They felt massive, ancient, and unfinished, like scaffolding for a world still under construction. My ears popped, pressure building behind my eyes. Every instinct screamed to look away, but I couldn't. The distortion pulsed gently, almost breathing. For a brief, terrifying moment, I had the certainty that the air wasn't bending on its own. Something on the other side was pressing back. The structures became clearer the longer I stared, though clarity might be the wrong word. They resolved themselves the way a dream sharpens right before you wake up. Detailed, yet fundamentally wrong. Towers rose without bases, their lower edges dissolving into nothing. While their upper reaches vanished into angles my eyes refused to follow. Some surfaces looked smooth as glass, others fractured, layered over each other like overlapping shadows, pretending to be solid. There were no straight lines, yet everything felt deliberate. The forms repeated in patterns that suggested purpose, not chaos, as if the place obeyed rules that simply weren't mine. Distances collapsed and expanded without warning. A structure that seemed miles away loomed closer when I blinked, while another receded the moment I focused on it. Depth was optional. Scale was a suggestion. What unsettled me most was the absence of decay. No erosion, no cracks, nothing broken. These weren't ruins. They were maintained, sustained by principles that didn't rely on gravity or time. I realized then that physics hadn't failed here. It had been replaced. As the air continued to shimmer, I felt a subtle pressure in my chest, like standing near something powerful and unshielded. The architecture wasn't built for us, but it wasn't hostile either. It was indifferent, the way a city is indifferent to an ant crossing its streets. And standing there, watching a world overlap my own. I understood a quiet, horrifying truth. This place wasn't appearing. It had always been there, at first. The sound blended into everything else, the wind in the canopy, blood in my ears, my own breath trying to steady itself. But once I noticed it, I couldn't unhear it. The song wasn't coming from a single direction. It surrounded me without distance, threading through the bending air like it belonged there more than I did. Each note lingered a moment too long, overlapping the next in a way that made time feel soft. It wasn't music as I understood it. There was no rhythm I could follow, no melody to hum. And yet, it felt intentional, responsive. When my breathing quickened, the pitch shifted, When I took a step back, the sound stretched, thinning, as if disappointed. I realized then that it wasn't getting louder by moving closer. It was getting closer by learning me. Memories surfaced without warning, irrelevant things. The smell of my childhood home, a face I hadn't thought about in years. The song wrapped around those thoughts, weaving them into itself, testing how tightly they were held. I pressed my hands over my ears. It didn't help. The sound wasn't entering me. It was resonating. For a brief, irrational moment. I understood the temptation to follow it. The song promised nothing out loud, yet it carried an invitation older than fear. It didn't demand attention. It waited for consent. Bill Hutchins had been a ranger since the late 60s, back when reports were typed on carbon paper and mistakes could be buried with enough patience. He moved slowly, not from age, but from habit, like someone who'd learned that sudden actions drew the wrong kind of attention. When I finally asked him about the upper slopes, he didn't pretend not to understand. He just closed the door. He told me the first disappearance he'd worked happened in 1960. A family picnic, clear weather. One child stepped off the trail to relieve himself and never came back. No footprints, no sound. The search lasted weeks, then quietly ended. The paperwork was rewritten until it sounded reasonable. That was the pattern. Bill explained that the forest didn't take people all at once. It selected them. Calm minds, curious ones, people who noticed when things didn't line up. He said panic disrupted whatever process was happening, made the area unstable. That's why experienced hikers went missing more often than novices. They paid attention. He leaned closer and lowered his voice. It learns, he said. Not about traps or routes, but about us. How long we linger, what we fear, what we remember. He admitted they'd tried everything. Fences, signs, patrols. None of it mattered. Before I left, Bill added one last thing. Every few years, it changes how it reaches out. Then he met my eyes. And when it does, someone new starts asking questions. Bill didn't use that term at first. He circled around it, describing effects before causes, like he was afraid naming the thing would make it solid. People didn't vanish, he said. They remained, just not here in the way we understood. Their bodies were secondary. What mattered was something less visible and far more useful. He explained it like this. Certain minds leave impressions, strong ones, memories with weight. When those people crossed into the zone, the overlap thickened, reality held longer. The breach stabilized, not because of flesh, but because of identity, who they were, what they remembered. The missing became reference points, pinning two incompatible worlds together. That was why time behaved strangely around the zone, why radios warped, why the air bent. The anchors created tension, like nails driven through fabric that didn't want to meet. Remove them, and the fabric snapped back. Leave them too long. And the tear widened. I asked what happened to the people themselves. Bill hesitated. He said some stayed aware. Some forgot everything, except the feeling of being needed. And some changed so much they no longer qualified as human, though they still wore familiar shapes. The worst part, he said quietly, is that it doesn't work without consent. Not fully. The zone didn't just take people. It waited for them to recognize it. That was when I understood why the calm ones disappeared first. The silence wasn't accidental. Bill made that clear. It was engineered, refined over decades into something smooth enough to pass for bureaucracy. Every incident that drifted too close to the zone was filtered, softened, translated into language that implied error instead of anomaly. Lost hikers became victims of weather. Missing families were reassigned causes that didn't invite questions. The truth was never denied. It was diluted. Bill told me about the first time federal oversight stepped in. Men in plain jackets, no insignias, who asked the same questions repeatedly, not to learn, but to decide what could be erased. Reports were edited before they were archived. Audio recordings vanished. Maps were revised by people who never set foot in the forest. The blank circle remained, not as a warning, but as a compromise. Public panic was the official concern. Unofficially, it was liability. Acknowledging the zone meant admitting the park wasn't fully under human control. Worse, it meant admitting something else was. Funding followed silence. Careers depended on compliance. Rangers who pushed too hard found themselves transferred, retired early, or quietly discredited. Bill said the policy wasn't to solve the problem. It was to slow it down. Containment through neglect. Let the zone feed just enough to stay quiet, small enough to stay deniable. When I asked who made that call, Bill shook his head. No one person, he said. That's how it survives. I didn't tell anyone what I was going to do. Not Bill, not the station chief. The fewer people who knew, the less chance the idea would collapse under caution or fear. The decision settled in quietly, the way dangerous ones often do, fully formed before I realized I'd stopped arguing with myself. If the zone responded to recognition, then intent mattered. I couldn't bring a team. I couldn't bring witnesses. I prepared at night, packing only what wouldn't attract attention. No radio, no GPS, just a headlamp, a notebook, and the syringe wrapped carefully in gauze. The compound inside was experimental, pulled from research notes Bill had shown me, but never approved. A temporary disruption of memory formation, aggressive enough to blur identity without causing permanent damage. In theory. As I crossed the tree line, the forest felt different, not hostile, watchful. The air pressed inward, as if narrowing the path behind me. Every step forward made the world behind feel less certain, like a dream you can't quite return to once you wake. I marked nothing, left no tape, no footprints I could trust. The last human sound I heard was my own breathing. Slow, controlled. I focused on the reason I'd come. Jennifer. And everyone like her. Suspended between moments. If the zone needed an anchor, I would become unstable ground. I crossed the line knowing there would be no record of it. Only consequences. The forest inside the zone didn't look destroyed. That was the first lie it told. Trees still stood. Moss still clung to stone. But nothing behaved the way it should. Shadows lagged behind the objects that cast them, stretching a second too late, like after-images burned into the air. When I stepped forward, the ground responded with a delay, my weight sinking after I'd already shifted away. Time fractured in small, humiliating ways. A bird took flight twice. My headlamp flickered, illuminating the same branch in two different positions. Both correct. I checked my watch and found the second hand trembling, caught between ticks, refusing to commit. The forest wasn't frozen. It was undecided. Paths folded back on themselves. I walked in a straight line and returned to the same fallen log 3 times, each pass older than the last. The bark darkened. Rot spread. On the 4th pass, the log was gone, replaced by bare earth that smelled freshly turned. Something was editing as I moved. Sound behaved worst of all, My footsteps echoed before they landed. Leaves crunched behind me when nothing was there. Once. I heard my own voice whisper my name from somewhere to my left, perfectly imitated, down to the hesitation I hadn't realized I had. This wasn't chaos. It was a system under strain. The forest wasn't broken because it was damaged. It was broken because it was being asked to be two places at once. I found her near a stand of trees that didn't cast shadows. She was sitting on a fallen trunk, boots planted firmly in the dirt, adjusting the straps on her pack like she was about to stand up and keep hiking. For a second, I thought I was too late, that whatever took people had already finished with her. Then she looked up and smiled. She wasn't injured. She wasn't starving. Her clothes were clean, her hands steady. When she spoke, her voice sounded exactly like it had over the radio, calm, focused, faintly amused. She asked if the fog had lifted yet. She said she'd only stopped for a moment because the trail markers didn't make sense. According to her watch, she'd been there less than an hour. I told her she'd been missing for 3 years. The words felt absurd as soon as I said them, like a lie spoken in the wrong language. Jennifer frowned, checked her watch again, then laughed softly. "That's not possible," she said. "I haven't even finished lunch." Around us, the air pulsed gently, tightening with each exchange, as if something was listening closely. Jennifer didn't seem to notice. She was anchored to her certainty, to the continuity of her thoughts. That was when I understood. This place hadn't trapped her body. It had preserved her moment, and as long as she remembered who she was. The door stayed open. They didn't appear all at once. There was no dramatic entrance, no tearing of space or surge of light. The shapes simply became noticeable, like realizing you've been sharing a room with someone who never moved enough to catch your eye. The air thickened, pressure building behind my ears, and the world narrowed until Jennifer and I felt like the only solid things left. They communicated without voices, meaning pressed directly into my thoughts, careful and deliberate, as if tested before being shared. They showed me images, not of conquest or hunger, but of collapse. A world thinning the way ours did here, structures failing, continuity unraveling. They were not predators. They were refugees. They explained their need with unsettling precision. They couldn't fully exist in our reality without points of reference. Human memory provided that. Identity, experience, emotional continuity. These things had weight across dimensions. When a person crossed over and remained aware, their presence stabilized the overlap. Anchors, Bill's word, suddenly felt accurate. Jennifer was valuable not because she was weak, but because she was intact, curious, calm. Her memories were clean, uninterrupted. Through her, the connection held steady, through many like her. It grew. They showed me the alternative. If the anchors failed, the overlap would collapse violently, tearing through both worlds. Survival, not malice, drove them. Understanding that didn't make the choice easier. It made it unavoidable. The solution revealed itself the way nightmares do, not sudden, but inevitable. Once I understood how the anchors worked, every path forward narrowed into the same shape. The entities needed continuity, memory, selfhood, not bodies, not blood. If those things were disrupted, the overlap weakened. If enough anchors failed at once, the structure holding the breach together would collapse inward. They didn't hide that from me. They showed me outcomes instead of arguments. Futures where the zone sealed violently, swallowing everything nearby. Futures where it stayed open and spread, reality thinning mile by mile, and one narrow possibility where the anchors unraveled quietly, painlessly, rewriting events so the missing were never missing at all. The cost was unbearable. Those people wouldn't return. They wouldn't die. Either. They would be edited out, absorbed into causality, replaced by accidents, missteps, ordinary endings. The world would continue smoothly, unaware of what it had been spared. Only the ones who acted would remember there had ever been another version. Jennifer looked at me as the understanding settled in. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. Something in my expression was enough. She shook her head once, slowly, not in fear, but in recognition. She knew what being an anchor meant. She knew what letting go would cost. The entities waited. They did not force the choice. They never had. That was the most horrifying part. I didn't tell Jennifer what I was about to do. Some things become impossible the moment they're shared. I took the syringe from my pocket and checked it one last time. Hand steady in a way that surprised me. The liquid inside looked harmless, almost clear, carrying no hint of the damage it was meant to cause. A temporary severing. The note said, memory without continuity, identity without anchor. The entities felt the decision before I acted. The pressure in the air shifted, tightening, then easing, like a lung bracing for impact. I pressed the needle into my arm and injected the compound slowly, deliberately. Giving myself time to change my mind, I didn't. The effects were immediate. Thoughts slid apart, losing their edges. Names unraveled. The forest fractured into overlapping impressions, none of them willing to stay. I felt myself becoming unreliable, my memories loosening their grip on sequence and meaning. Exactly as intended. The world responded. The structures beyond the bending air flickered, their outlines blurring as if drawn in charcoal and smeared by an unseen hand. The pressure vanished. The song collapsed into silence. Somewhere, something gave way, as my mind emptied. A final understanding surfaced. The system required consent, but it didn't care whose. By erasing myself as an anchor, I destabilized everything tied to me. The entities receded, pulled back by the collapse they could no longer hold open. The last thing I remember clearly is Jennifer's face. Not frightened, relieved. Then even that slipped away. I woke up in my bunk at the ranger station with a headache that felt earned. The kind that comes after a night you can't quite reconstruct. Sunlight cut through the blinds. Morning routine. Normality. Heavy and convincing. It took me several minutes to realize something was wrong. Not missing, but misplaced. A name hovered just out of reach, like a word on the tip of the tongue that refuses to surface. I checked the incident logs out of habit. No missing hiker reports, no search and rescue alerts. The month of June passed cleanly, uninterrupted by anything unusual. When I searched the database for Jennifer Walsh, the system returned nothing. No record, no permits, no employment history. It was as if she had never applied pressure to the world hard enough to leave a mark. I asked Bill about the case I thought I remembered. He frowned, genuinely confused, and suggested I take the day off. "You've been working too many hours," he said. The concern in his voice was real. That terrified me more than disbelief would have. Later, hiking near Klingman's Dome, I found a familiar clearing. The place felt heavy, emotionally charged without context. I stood there longer than I meant to, waiting for something to resolve. Nothing did. The world had smoothed itself over, erasing a wrinkle it never intended to acknowledge. And yet, deep down, I knew something precious had been lost, something I was no longer allowed to grieve. The gaps didn't announce themselves. They revealed their edges slowly, through discomfort rather than absence. I'd start a sentence and stall halfway through, unsure what I'd meant to say. Faces felt familiar without context. Certain dates carried weight I couldn't justify, leaving me uneasy for reasons I couldn't explain. I began finding notes in my own handwriting that I didn't remember writing. Margins filled with circles, trail names underlined twice, then crossed out. Once. I found the word anchor scribbled repeatedly until the pen tore through the paper. I had no memory of doing it, but the urgency bled through the ink. Photos were worse. Group shots where everyone smiled at someone just outside the frame. Empty space that felt intentional, curated by something that knew exactly how much to remove. I'd stare at those images, heart racing. Certain I was missing a person-shaped absence. Sleep offered no relief. Dreams replayed events without narrative, standing in a forest that wouldn't settle, hearing a song without sound, feeling relief over a decision I couldn't remember making. I'd wake with my hands clenched, convinced I'd agreed to something enormous in another version of myself. The doctors called it stress, mild dissociation, a common response to isolation work. Their explanations fit too well, sliding neatly into the holes they were meant to cover. But holes don't close on their own. They remain, shaping everything around them. And whatever had been removed from my past was still exerting force, quietly, patiently, pulling at the edges of the present. For a while, nothing happened. That was the most convincing part. Reports near the upper slopes dropped to zero. No lost hikers, no strange radio interference. Even the animals returned. Trails marked by prints and droppings like the forest was healing itself. Officially, the zone was declared stable. Unofficially, people stopped talking about it altogether. I walked the perimeter often, though I couldn't explain why. The air felt heavier there, but calm. Like a lake after a storm settles. The distortions were gone. No bending light. No wrong shadows. Just trees, wind, and the familiar ache in my head that flared whenever I lingered too long. Bill retired that year. His replacement never mentioned the circle. At night, I sometimes dreamed of standing at a locked door, hand on the handle, knowing something on the other side was waiting without urgency, not trapped, resting. The feeling followed me into waking hours, a sense of suspension rather than relief, as if the problem hadn't been solved, only paused. The forest seemed aware of the quiet. Birds avoided certain clearings. Fog gathered where it shouldn't. Once, during a routine patrol, my radio crackled with a burst of static shaped almost like a voice before correcting itself. I stood still, heart racing. But nothing followed. Whatever lived beyond the zone wasn't gone. It was conserving itself, sleeping lightly. And I had the unsettling certainty that when it woke again, it would remember me, even if I didn't remember it. The first report came from a hiker who swore his shadow had taken an extra step after he stopped walking. He laughed when he told it, embarrassed, blaming exhaustion. 2 weeks later, another visitor claimed her footprints reversed direction halfway down the trail, as if she'd been walking backward without noticing. These incidents were logged as curiosities, filed away with a quiet sense of déjà vu no one wanted to name. By late summer, the patterns were harder to ignore. Compasses drifted again. Fog thickened in clear weather, pooling in narrow corridors that stretched too far and led nowhere familiar. I felt it before I understood it. The same pressure behind the eyes, the same subtle wrongness that had once defined the forbidden slopes. The quiet had ended. One evening, my radio picked up a transmission that wasn't meant for me. No call sign, no location, just breathing. Slow and measured, layered with a faint harmonic hum I recognized immediately. My hands shook as I cut the channel. The sound lingered anyway, vibrating somewhere deeper than hearing. I returned to the clearing I could never quite forget. The air there shimmered faintly, not enough to see, but enough to feel. The forest wasn't tearing open. It was stretching, testing its limits, probing for the shape it had once held. The zone was waking up, and whatever I had broken to quiet, it was no longer enough to keep it asleep. I saw her at the edge of the fog, standing where the trees thinned unnaturally, their branches stopping short, as if they'd learned where not to grow. At first, I thought my mind was filling in one of its familiar gaps, offering a shape to explain the unease. Then she moved. Jennifer looked almost the same, but not entirely. The outlines of her body wavered, like a reflection disturbed by water. Her face held the memory of expression rather than the thing itself, familiar, restrained, slightly delayed. When she spoke my name, it echoed twice, once in my ears and once somewhere deeper, where thoughts usually stay private. She told me she wasn't gone, not erased, just displaced. Time didn't pass for her the way it did for us. Moments stacked instead of flowing, and she existed in the spaces between them. She could see both sides now, the forest as we knew it, and the other structure pressing through, patient and incomplete. I couldn't stay, she said softly, and I couldn't leave. The zone hadn't released her when the anchors collapsed. It had redistributed her, stretching her across the thinning boundary. She wasn't human anymore, not fully, but she wasn't one of them either. As the fog thickened, I felt the pressure return, familiar and terrible. Jennifer met my eyes, steady despite her shifting form. "It's starting again," she said, "and this time it knows you're listening." Then she stepped back, and the forest folded shut where she'd been. They came through more clearly this time, no longer content with suggestion or pressure. The air thickened, and the familiar distortion returned, bending the forest into overlapping layers. I felt them before I saw them, not as bodies, but as presence, dense with intention. When they spoke, it was slower, heavier, as if each thought had to push through resistance to reach me. They showed me their world again, but with more honesty. Not collapse from violence or war, but from exhaustion. Laws unraveling, continuity failing, a universe running out of permission to exist. They hadn't crossed into ours out of conquest. They crossed because there was nowhere else left. They explained that the overlap was never meant to expand unchecked. The anchors were a temporary measure, a scaffold built from borrowed identity. Crude, inelegant, necessary. When I disrupted it, I didn't destroy them. I destabilized their last refuge. Survival forced adaptation. That was why the zone had begun testing the boundary again, searching for a configuration that wouldn't tear either world apart. They understood our fear. They felt it constantly, leaking across the thinning divide. But fear was not what threatened us. Incompatibility was. Two realities occupying the same space without translation. They waited for my response, not with urgency, but with the resignation of beings who had already lost one home. For the first time, I saw them clearly, not as monsters pressing at the edges of our world, but as refugees standing in the ruins of theirs, asking if there was room for one more impossible solution. They showed me the futures the way one might present evidence, without commentary, without mercy. In one, the boundary was sealed completely. The overlap collapsed in on itself, clean and absolute. Their world went dark, not in fire or noise, but in quiet erasure. a reality blinking out, leaving behind nothing but mathematical absence. Our forest remained. The park thrived. And somewhere deep in the soil, an unmarked grave held an entire universe no one would ever know had existed. In the other future, the seal failed. The zone widened slowly at first, then faster, feeding on coincidence and curiosity. Trails looped into themselves. Towns near the park thinned, buildings stretching and warping until occupancy became optional. Humanity adapted for a while, rewriting laws of physics into superstition, then into desperation. We didn't lose a war. We dissolved into overlap. Both endings were stable. That was the worst part. The universe accepted either outcome without resistance. Survival didn't favor morality. It favored equilibrium. They told me there was no third path in their models. No outcome where everyone remained intact. Something had to give. A species, a history, a definition of what it meant to exist in one place at one time. As the visions faded, they waited again, patient in the way only the truly desperate can afford to be. I understood then that my earlier choice hadn't solved anything. It had only delayed the reckoning. And this time, delay was no longer an option. The idea came from exhaustion, not brilliance, staring at two endings that demanded annihilation. My mind searched for something smaller, less absolute. If the problem was overlap without structure, then structure was the missing piece. Not a door, not a wall, a framework. I told them neither future was acceptable, not because one was cruel and the other unjust, but because both assumed separation was the only language reality understood. What if it wasn't? What if the zone wasn't a wound to be closed or a leak to be plugged, but an interface that had formed without guidance? A bridge wouldn't erase the boundary, it would define it. A controlled convergence where translation replaced invasion. Limited access. Stabilized exchange, not anchored by stolen memory, but by willing participation. Conscious nodes instead of trapped ones. They resisted at first. Their existence was shaped by collapse, not cooperation. But when I described humans capable of perceiving both states, caretakers rather than anchors, the pressure shifted. Interest replaced urgency. The zone responded too. The air settling into a steadier rhythm, distortion smoothing instead of straining. A bridge required sacrifice, just not indiscriminate loss. Those who crossed fully would change, permanently, becoming something that belonged to both realities and neither. It was not a rescue, it was a responsibility. I told them I would be the first, for the first time since this began. The waiting ended, and the forest listened. No announcement was made. There were no forms to sign, no committees to approve what couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The call moved quietly, through gaps in records and people already standing near the edges of things. Rangers with too many years in the field. Scientists whose research never passed peer review. Locals who'd lost time and never stopped wondering where it went. I didn't explain everything. Some truths don't survive full disclosure. I told them enough, that the zone was changing, that it needed caretakers, and that stepping forward meant leaving parts of themselves behind. No one asked about pay. No one asked about recognition. They asked how permanent it was. They asked whether it would hurt. The changes began before anyone crossed fully. Dreams shifted first. Shared symbols appeared independently. Bridges. Fog. Mirrored paths. Some volunteers developed a second sense for distortion. Nausea blooming near thinning air. Others reported hearing tones just below hearing. Harmonics that aligned when they stood together. The zone was tuning itself to them. One man backed out the night before. No judgment followed. Consent mattered. It always had. Those who stayed stepped into the overlap with open eyes, accepting the erosion of certainty that came with it. Their bodies remained mostly human. Their perceptions did not. As for me, I felt the bridge taking shape, not as a structure, but as a role. I wasn't crossing anymore. I was staying. Holding the line between worlds meant surrendering the idea that either side would ever feel like home again. The change wasn't sudden. There was no moment I could point to and say, "This is where I stopped being human." It happened the way erosion happens, grain by grain, unnoticed until the shape is no longer what it was. At first, it was sensory. Colors deepened, distances gained texture. I could feel the boundary before I saw it, a pressure gradient across my skin, like standing near an electrical field. Then, memory began to reorganize. Not vanish, but lose priority. Events stopped lining up chronologically, and instead arranged themselves by relevance, by emotional weight. I could recall a conversation that hadn't happened yet with the same clarity as childhood. The zone didn't confuse time. It flattened it. My body adapted reluctantly. Hunger faded. Sleep became optional, replaced by long periods of stillness where thought drifted without urgency. When I spoke, my voice carried differently, resonating in ways that unsettled the others. I learned to modulate it, the way you learn to soften your steps in an unfamiliar house. The entities no longer pressed against my thoughts. They communicated sideways now, through shared perception rather than translation. I understood them without agreement. That was the price. Empathy without alignment. Awareness without belonging. I looked at my reflection once, in a darkened ranger station window, and saw something subtly misregistered, my outline lagging, my eyes holding too much depth. I didn't look monstrous. I looked intermediate. I realized then that becoming something else didn't mean losing myself. It meant becoming a place where two truths could exist without tearing each other apart. Klingman's dome no longer behaved like a summit. It became a threshold, though nothing about it looked different to the casual eye. Tourists still climbed the observation tower. Clouds still rolled in without warning. But beneath that familiarity, the zone had acquired tension, like a drawn bow held in perfect balance. We learned to read it, shifts in pressure, subtle distortions in sound. When the boundary thinned, we stepped in, not to close it, but to shape it. The bridge wasn't a structure you could point to. It was a process, maintained through presence and attention. Left alone, it would drift. Neglected, it would tear. Those of us who remained became reference points, living gradients between incompatible rules. Too human, and the overlap rejected us. Too altered, and we lost our footing here. Balance was survival. We learned restraint, letting curiosity pass without feeding it, guiding the zone's expansion into predictable patterns instead of fractures. Sometimes, people wandered too close. We redirected them gently, misplacing trails, encouraging wrong turns, adjusting probability just enough to keep them safe. They left with unease they couldn't name, stories they'd eventually forget. That was the kindness of it. At night, the forest breathed differently. The song returned, softer now, harmonized rather than searching. The entities settled into the rhythm, no longer pressing, no longer starving. I understood then what we'd become, not guards or gods, but infrastructure. A living boundary doesn't stop movement. It makes movement survivable. If you're reading this, it means the system still allows for records, which is a good sign. It means the balance is holding. I don't know how long that will remain true, or whether my words will eventually lose their edges and become something symbolic instead of literal. That's acceptable. Meaning adapts. It always has. The forest is quiet tonight, but not empty. The difference matters. Silence used to feel like anticipation. Now it feels like agreement. The boundary responds to attention, not force. I've learned that control was never the point. Translation was. We didn't save either world. We taught them how to stop tearing at each other. I think about the people who stepped forward. Some still walk among us, altered just enough to notice when the air leans the wrong way. Others faded into roles that no longer require names. None of us regret it. Regret needs a single perspective, and we don't have that luxury anymore. As for me, I remain where I'm most useful. Memory comes and goes. Faces blur, but intention holds. If the zone wakes too sharply, I'll feel it. If curiosity turns dangerous, I'll redirect it. That's my job now, as long as the bridge stands. To whoever finds this, the wall was never broken. It was unfinished. Fear tried to seal it. Curiosity tried to widen it. We chose something harder. We chose to stay. And if you ever feel the forest listening, remember this. It's not waiting to take you. It's waiting to be understood.